Story 1. Memories of a Police Officer. My name is John, and I'm a police officer on Vancouver Island off the west coast of Canada. What I'm about to share happened in the early 90s, back when I was a young officer, a dark story that still haunts me to this day. At the time, a kidnapping case shook our small community. A 3-year-old child mysteriously disappeared from a park in our neighborhood. I was about 25 years old when it happened. The news spread quickly, making national headlines and putting everyone on edge. Little did I know I'd soon be involved in another disturbing case that would eerily tie back to this disappearance. It was a cold autumn night, not long after the kidnapping. My partner and I were on a routine patrol with a cameraman tagging along to film footage for a police program. From what I remember, that footage was never aired, for reasons that will soon become clear. What we didn't expect was for the events of that night to change our lives forever. Back then, having someone film a cop's daily routine was rare. These days, it's pretty normal. The night was quiet. Despite the kidnapping, the streets were dark and empty. That's when I spotted a familiar van. It belonged to a man named Peter Hogbin, a troubled individual. I'd stopped him several times before for driving without insurance, but there was something about him. Something darker. I couldn't explain it, but I always had a bad feeling about him. Hogbin was an unsettling figure. His hollow eyes seemed to hide dark secrets, and his presence made people uneasy. Neighbors reported strange behavior, seeing him wandering the streets late at night and hearing muffled screams coming from his house. And then there was the dead chicken hanging from his van's rearview mirror. Not exactly something you'd expect or want to see. We ran his info through the radio and confirmed he was still driving uninsured. With no choice, we signaled him to pull over. What followed was a scene that made no sense and still fills me with unease to this day. And yes, the cameraman was recording everything. Hogbin stepped out of the van, visibly unhinged, his eyes bulging with rage. He yelled and gestured wildly, invading our personal space, pacing back and forth. It felt like he was about to attack. My partner and I kept our hands close to our weapons, ready to respond if necessary. Shootouts involving police are rare in Canada, especially back in the 90s, so that moment, it was terrifying. Suddenly, Hogbin turned his fury on his own van, punching the dashboard in a blind rage. It was like watching a caged animal breaking free. Nowadays, he'd probably be arrested on the spot. But back in the 90s, as disturbing as his behavior was, it wasn't enough to take him in. It was bizarre. The man was tearing his own vehicle apart, ripping out pieces of the dashboard and items from under the seat. And then, like a switch had been flipped, he calmed down. To this day, I can't make sense of it. In a chillingly calm voice, he asked if he could grab his tools from the back of the van, tools that would soon become the instruments of something unimaginable. Legally, we had no reason to deny him, so we allowed it. Hogbin vanished into the night with a hatchet, a tool belt, and a hammer. My partner muttered words that still haunt me. Jesus, he's so mad, he looks like he could kill someone. Words that should never have been spoken. And yes, the cameraman caught it all. We impounded the van, and the night carried on. The next morning, during our briefing, devastating news broke. A woman had been beaten to death the previous night, her body discovered in a pool of blood. Officers were told to report any suspicions or leads to the sergeant to pass on to the detectives. Story 2. The Call. I'm Officer Bradley. I retired from the police force 10 years ago at the age of 50. I'm going to share a story from my 20 years on the job, a story that stuck to me like a deep thorn. It happened on January 17th, 2005. We got a call about a woman who had locked herself in a bathroom. She said her boyfriend was trying to kill her. My partner Mason and I arrived at a house at the end of a quiet street. The streetlights flickered a dim yellow glow, and the wind made the trees and bushes sway. Heavy clouds loomed overhead, and the air was cold as ice. We positioned ourselves at the front door and knocked. "Police! Open up!" Only the sound of wind chimes answered. Mason kicked the door with all his strength. We searched the downstairs area of the house. Nothing. Everything was clear. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Mason looked toward the top of the stairs, soft crying. A woman. It was almost like a muffled whisper coming from behind a door in one of the rooms upstairs. "She said she was downstairs," Mason pointed out. We climbed the stairs. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I began. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The crying suddenly stopped, like someone had paused a recording. Then it started again. "But he's still here," the woman said from inside the room. "My partner and I searched the whole house. There's no one here, ma'am. You're safe." Downstairs, the front door slammed shut with a loud bang. Mason and I exchanged glances, and I noticed sweat dripping down his face despite the cold night. I nodded for him to check it out. He leaned over the top of the stairs and peered at the door below. "Probably just the wind," he said. Then a soft voice came from inside the bathroom. "Are you sure about that, Officer Bradley?" the woman asked. That night, neither Mason nor I mentioned our names out loud, not even once. "Ma'am, do you need help or not?" Mason was losing patience. "We need to make sure you're okay, so step away from the door because I'm about to kick it in." Part of me believed Mason was more eager to see her face, to find out who she was and how she knew what she knew, than to ensure her safety. He wanted answers. "Wait, hold on," I said. "She might be standing too close to the door. We don't want to hurt her." And then she said it. "Officer Bradley, tell Mason that if he touches this door, I'll pay a visit to his family one night and kick down one of my own." Her voice dropped a tone as she said it. I never understood the phrase "turn white as a ghost." Do people really go pale like that? I found out they do because I saw my partner's reaction to those chilling words. I couldn't stop him from kicking in the door this time. But when he did, there was no one inside. There wasn't even a window above the shower to escape through, nor another door to slip out of. And yet, we were sure we had just had an entire conversation with a woman behind that door. We searched the house again, every inch, including the backyard. Nothing. Mason and I didn't speak for the rest of the night. When it was time to leave, we exchanged a glance and walked out of that house without looking back. Now comes the part of the story I've never told anyone. Not even Mason. We were already shaken enough, so I didn't want to tell him what I'm about to share with you now. When we left the house, I was the one who drove us back to the station that night. He probably thought I didn't notice, but his hands were trembling so much he couldn't drive safely. He doesn't drink coffee. As I backed the patrol car out of the street, Mason didn't look back at the house. But the truth is, I did. And honestly, I wish I hadn't. I looked and squinted toward a trash bin beside the house. That's when I saw it, a dark, strange figure crouched near the gate as if it was watching us leave. And as we finally pulled away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, the figure began to rise. Slowly. And I swear, to this day, that as it stood up, it didn't stop until its head rose higher than the roof of that 2-story house. My partner and I exchanged a look. A sinking feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. Without hesitation, we raised our hands and shared our suspicions. We knew who might have committed such a brutal crime. Well, Hogben had certainly been angry enough to kill someone. A witness reported seeing him following another woman, but she managed to get inside her house before he could do anything. She was shaken and terrified. Hogben was arrested quickly, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The victim's blood and DNA were found on his hatchet. But what shocked us most were the disturbing items discovered in his van after his arrest. Newspaper clippings about missing children, including the recently kidnapped boy. Photos of women taken without their knowledge. Journals filled with graphic descriptions of violent acts. The community was in shock, speculating about Hogben's possible connection to the child's disappearance. The boy's parents lived in constant agony, the uncertainty eating away at them. My partner and I were consumed by guilt, wondering if we could have done something to prevent the tragedy. Nightmares and flashbacks plagued me. I relived that fateful night over and over, imagining scenarios where I acted differently. The stress and guilt tore my marriage apart. I withdrew from my family, becoming a shadow of the man I once was. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in town to profile the child's kidnapper learned about the Hogben case. They demanded to see the footage of our encounter with him on the night of the murder. What they saw left them stunned. They said it was rare to capture the exact moment a psychopath awakens and decides to kill. They wanted to take the footage to Quantico to train new agents, using it as an example of that terrifying moment. My partner and I had unknowingly become part of a video that would be studied for years, but to us, it was a constant reminder of what felt like our failure. A moment frozen in time, haunting us with what could have been, and the missing child. Michael Donaghy was never found. Despite suspicions, no concrete evidence tied Hogben to the kidnapping. The FBI couldn't determine if the boy was taken by a stranger or someone he knew. His name remains etched in the memory of an entire generation. If you're from Canada, you've probably heard of him. We never uncovered the truth behind his disappearance. And maybe we never will, but the impact of those events still lingers. Every time I see a face in the crowd that vaguely resembles Hogben, a chill runs down my spine. I wonder if he's still out there, hiding his true nature behind a mask of normalcy. Because I learned the hard way that monsters exist, and they don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they're right in front of us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that perhaps is the biggest lesson that distant night taught me. As a police officer, it's my duty to protect and serve. But that night, I feel like I failed. I failed that woman. I failed the missing child. And I failed myself, because in the end, we're all responsible for the evil we allow to happen. And that's a burden I'll carry with me for the rest of my days. Story 3, The Last Call. There are smells you never forget. The smell of death is one of them, and it was that odor that made me realize sometimes monsters don't hide. They show themselves, and we just don't know how to face them. 32 years on the force, and nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that night in Thunder Bay. Today, 10 years after hanging up my badge for the last time, I still wake up in a cold sweat. Some veterans say every cop has that one case that haunts them to the end. The kind of call that makes you question not just the job, but everything you believed about humanity. October 2015. I was 3 months from retirement, working my final night shifts along Route 61 near Lake Superior. It was a cold, silent night. The coffee in my thermos was lukewarm when the call came in. Unit 47, we've got reports of screams coming from the old Peterson cabin. The Peterson cabin. Every veteran cop in Thunder Bay knew that address. Back in the 90s, it was a known drug house. Then it sat abandoned, becoming the backdrop for urban legends rookies shared during shift changes. Occasionally, teens would break in to drink, nothing that warranted a call at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. When I pulled up to the house, a different kind of chill ran down my spine. The snow blanketed the yard, untouched except for a trail of tire tracks leading to an old Ford F-150. In the passenger seat, I recognized Harold Thompson, an ex-officer I'd served with back in 2009. He was hunched over, clutching his old badge like it was some kind of silent prayer. "Tom, there's a child in there," he said, his voice thick with despair. "For God's sake, why would anyone do that to her?" Harold shouldn't have been there. He'd been off the force for years due to mental health issues. What had brought him to that cabin in the dead of night? Something in his eyes told me he wasn't the same man I once knew. 27 years of experience told me to wait for backup. But the screams... Christ! Those screams pierced the soul. I knew I couldn't just stand there. "Sam, stay out here with Harold. I'll go in." Sam, my partner that night, hesitated but nodded. I drew my weapon and pushed the door open. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut. After 3 decades, you learn to recognize the stench of death. But this was different. It was older, deeper. The kitchen was chaos. Piles of dirty dishes, food wrappers scattered everywhere, rotting leftovers. Hoarders, I thought, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But there was more to it. The house felt alive. Every creak of the floor sounded like a sigh. Every shadow felt like a pair of eyes watching me. I moved down the hallway, gripping my gun tightly. The smell grew worse. It was like the darkness itself had weight. When I couldn't take it anymore, I covered my mouth and nose with my sleeve and opened the door to a bedroom. And that's when I saw it. 2 bodies on the bed, a man and a woman, both in an advanced state of decomposition. Their skin was gray, almost melting, and the flies buzzing like they were part of the room itself. But what made me step back was what lay in the woman's lap. She was holding a baby, no more than a year old, wrapped in a filthy blanket. The tiny body was barely distinguishable, but it was there. My mind fought against what I was seeing. Then something moved. A cockroach crawled out of the dead baby's mouth. My stomach churned. I stumbled out of the room, out of the house, as if something unseen was chasing me. Sam ran up to me. "What happened, Tom? What did you see?" he pressed, but I couldn't speak. Not then. The rest was pieced together later, with backup, the coroner, and the investigators. The couple had spiraled into opioid addiction after one of them had surgery. They started with painkillers, then moved to heroin. Their daughter, a young child, died from neglect, and when they found her body, they decided to take their own lives. They used what heroin they had left, enough to kill them twice over. It's easy to put a story like that in a report. Cause of death, overdose, circumstances, neglect, and despair. But for me, it didn't end there. For weeks, I dreamed about that scene. The baby in the mother's lap, the cockroach crawling out of its mouth. But what truly haunts me is the sound. In my dreams, the baby is always crying. No matter how many times I try to find it, to hold it, the crying never stops, and I wake up drenched in sweat, feeling like I never did enough. I retired the following week. I couldn't put on the uniform anymore without thinking about that night. I moved as far away from Thunder Bay as I could, and yet every now and then I hear the voice on the radio in my head. "Unit 47, what's your status?" Over, and I never know how to respond.